So yeah, my name is Sarah Bell. I work at Esri. Has anybody heard of Esri before? Cool. So what Esri is, it's a mapping software company. We design a lot of mapping software for a lot of different uses, but what we're mostly known for is ArcGIS Pro, ArcGIS Online, and ArcMap. And today I'm going to talk to you about creative cartography in our digital world. I'm going to take a really roundabout way of getting there. And I also need to say this because of the perfectionist that I am. These are not necessarily the fonts that I chose for this, but I couldn't embed the fonts, and that's my bad. So here's how this talk is going to go. We're going to talk about what is cartography. We're going to talk about why mappers map. And I'm going to be using answers from actual cartographers to explore that question. We're going to discuss the power of maps. And we're going to take a tour of creative mapping. So, a brief description of my job is basically, at Esri, we make mapping software, but we also have mapping customers. So people who government agencies and companies, et cetera, that need maps made for them. So I am a cartographer in a lot of those projects. And this could be anything from helping them choose colors, to looking at their data, to just finding out what they can do with data viz, maybe building a map from start to finish, sometimes just making a bunch of point symbols for them. So it really can vary. Cool. I'm panning for questions. OK, so how did I get here? Let's do that with logos. I got my Bachelor of Anthropology here at Western Washington University. And immediately upon graduating, I got what was my dream job at the time. I was a national park ranger at the North Cascades National Park. So what I like about Huxley and the North Cascades National Park is they're closely affiliated. So there's a lot of reciprocity between those two institutions. So what you might not know about park ranger is that a lot of those positions are seasonal. And I wanted to find a way to make this a full-time gig. So I discovered that a lot of the park scientists were using this thing called GIS. And I know this is a Huxley class, so a lot of, who knows what GIS is? OK, cool. Does anybody want to describe it? It's hard to describe, right? But we all know what it is. Someone take a stab at it. Otherwise, I'm going to.
Well, I'm going to embarrass myself by doing the introduction to GIS class right now.
Oh, that's fine.
Basically, I just see it as because I've been mapping geologic stuff in GIS, so it's just you take data and then you put it on the Earth, and it shows you what it looks like.
Right. It's taking data, putting on the Earth in some sort of software, and then showing you what it's look like. And you can take other data, and then you can do some sort of spatial math, right? You can find out where is the best place to put a new hospital based on demographics. So you use a bunch of different layers to analyze that question, or whatever. The possibilities are really endless. So I had no idea what GIS was when I was a park ranger, but I knew that I wanted to learn it because I wanted to work in the park full time. So at the time, my partner was studying for his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I decided to take their GIS certificate program. So I was living in Madison, Wisconsin, studying in the geography department. And what I didn't know when I started there was that, will you let me know if I'm running up against the clock? OK, I just thought of if I go off on a tangent. So what I didn't know is that University of Wisconsin-Madison is a historic cartography institution. They have professors like Arthur Robinson who taught there. And so this cartography side of things really influenced me. And I knew I was going to be a cartographer for a very long time. And then I moved back to Bellingham, and I started working at Colshan Cartographic Services with Chuck Kitterman. And I learned a lot about mapping while I worked there. And then I wanted to go back to school for more academic cartography. So I got my Master's of Science in Geography. That's when I had the great privilege of TAing for Stefan Freeling. And then immediately upon graduating, I got a job at Esri, and I've been there ever since. So thank you for being brave and saying what GIS is. So now what is cartography? Yeah. Making maps. Exactly what I wanted. I scheduled a full minute so we could discuss that, and you cut right to the chase. Cartography is making maps. So in a very literal sense, this word cartography is a mashup of two words that can be traced back all the way to ancient Greek. Carto comes from cartus, which was a single leaf of papyrus. which eventually over the years began to mean, things you write something on, and then it meant chart. And graphy comes from graphia, which means writing things down. But it wasn't until the mid-19th century, I think I have a mouse. Yeah, can't see my arrow. Okay, so it wasn't until the mid-19th century when the word cartography started being used, and that's all I have to say about that, moving forward. All right, so how old is cartography? Even though we weren't using cartography until the mid-19th century, people were making maps a lot further back than the mid-1850s. And a lot of first-year cartography students learn about these stick maps, which are actually really complicated maps that were used for thousands of years in Polynesia and Micronesia, because there's over 1,000 islands there, and they're very tiny. So in order to get resources, and your whole livelihood was dependent on getting to other islands and then getting back to your home island. And so these stick charts, which are made of sticks and shells and rocks, were actually really sophisticated tools that existed way before the word cartography. So, how do people choose cartography as a career? It's this profession that sometimes when you tell people you're a cartographer, they ask you quite point blank, do people still use maps? Do people still make maps? They treat it as this job that's really adorable, that you do this as a hobby, but why would you actually do it? It's even a joke among cartographers that when you tell people you're a cartographer, someone will always ask, hasn't everything already been mapped? So, speaking of which, jobs that have gone stale, who's ever heard of a knocker-upper? You have? Yes. So, knocker-uppers, I just found this out last week, people who were paid to go wake up people for work before alarm clocks were invented. So there's this lady, she's using some sort of spitball routine. It's probably really effective. And there's this man who, his method is a little less creative. He's just knocking on the window with a stick. And then there's, I don't know, for lack of a better term, a job where people before radars would have to listen for some other way in military operations for approaching people. So they put their ears against these. If I ever see one of those contraptions, I would love to test it out, see how well it works. But cartography is very much a real and current job. So here's a question that my friend Lauren Tierney, who makes maps for the Washington Post, asked last week, because she was giving a presentation yesterday. She says, this is on Twitter, cartographers basically communicate with one another via Twitter. Hello mappers, next week I will be giving a guest lecture on mapping to a journalism class. I have a list of topics, resources, etc., but I wanted to ask the community, what do you remember as being the one thing that got you initially hooked on mapping? So I really like this question. A lot of people answered, and I decided to take the 7 most common themes and show you what they are right here. So it might be a little hard to read. I'll just read them out for you. So Sarah McClellan is focused on the artistry and beauty of mapping. That's the top left. My friend Madura, just beneath her, she's another cartographer at Esri. She says that stuff she's interested makes more sense when it's on a map. So, and she's interested in the human impact on the environment. Then there's me down there, which I love the ability to be simultaneously artistic and scientific. And my friend Jen Mapes on the upper right, she's a professor of geography at Kent State University. She, before that, was a journalist. And she said she wanted to tell stories with her, when she's reporting, and the maps would capture these things that sometimes the text couldn't. Joshua Stevens feels that students really feel empowered and enlightened when they see data that interests them on a map. And then Justin Madrone understands the importance that maps have in decision making, and it's because of that GIS analysis. It's not just putting data on a page anymore, it's also discovering things that we couldn't without maps and analysis. And here's my favorite one by Shannon Kaliski, who she's also an Esri cartographer. She said, "No one wanted to listen to me, but through maps I had a voice. Then I realized it didn't have to stop with me. I could give a voice to others." So this is my stab at putting all of those answers into one answer, because these are cartographers giving the answer. It's not someone who, this is what we think is mapping. So when we're mapping, this is what we're thinking about. It's a scientific and creative way to convey data and information that matters to us. So when I say us, I'm going to be very honest with you. We're saying it matters to us, not you. It matters to us or the people who are paying us to make the map. It's very important to know about maps, into legible stories and context so that others will know the importance of the story. To map is to have a spatial voice. Any questions? All right, cool. So what cartography means today. So who has a map hanging on their wall at home? Awesome. Raise your hands again and keep them up for a second. Okay, why do you have a map on your wall? What is it about the map that, sure, you too.
I really like to look at a map and go on adventures in my mind because I know they represent real places.
Cool. And why do you?
I market the places I've been.
Okay, awesome. And anyone else want to tell me? Yes.
I actually have fantasy maps and like fictional maps.
Oh, awesome. Fantasy maps.
Yeah.
Great.
So places of books and whatnot.
Awesome. And then, yes.
I made the map myself. Really proud of it.
Oh, awesome. I'd love to see that. Well, yeah, we also, today in the professional world in cartography, we find that people love maps because they're beautiful. So those of you who have a map hanging on their wall, raise your hand again if you think it's ugly. Right? So this is what we think of cartography now. We think of cartography as pretty maps. So yesterday was GIS Day. Woo! And GIS has been around since the late 1960s and really the 1970s. And with this growth over the past several decades, with all this powerful stuff you can do with GIS, we now have people who are analysts, data collectors. We have people who are programmers and coders who are making maps. And they're not necessarily concerned with the aesthetic of the map. And that is not a dig. It's very important that they're part of this. But they're making maps that reveal these very important truths and very illuminating things, but they don't consider themselves cartographers anymore. So who answered, what is cartography? What did you say?
Making maps.
Right, so we have people now making maps who don't consider themselves cartographers anymore. And I think that is a pretty bad thing. And the reason why is, number one, when we think cartography is a pretty map, we fall into the trap that pretty cartography is a good map, or pretty map is good cartography. So I am very against map shaming. I don't like people showing maps and then saying what's wrong with it, unless it's telling you a pretty egregious lie. So I thought about putting this slide in for a long time last night and taking it out, but I decided to keep it in because I am comfortable with telling you that it's not the best looking map. All right? So what this map is, the cartographer from movematcher.com made this map where the darker green areas have higher violence and the lighter areas have less violence. And this is the neighborhoods in the city of Chicago. Who knew that already? Awesome. I did my thesis on Chicago. I will not bore you with any more details on that. But this was part of this movematcher.com. If you were going to move to Chicago, you might look them up and they would help connect you with somebody who would make your move cheaper or easier or whatever. They connect you with people who are in the business of moving people. And they also do these articles of like where schools are good or where to be around craft breweries or whatever. And this article, I did not like at all. It was about violence in Chicago and telling you places to not move. And this was the map that they put in there. So even though this map violates some cartography rules, is it still cartography? Yes, it is. And here's why. Because it's a scientific, and I'm sure the person thought a creative way, to convey data and information that matters to them and the people that are paying them into legible stories and context so that you all feel like Chicago is a place you can move to only in certain spots. To map is to have a spatial voice. All right, so with that definition, I'm going to move forward with telling you that if cartography is creating some sort of text to tell you about space, then cartography has impacted all of you in one way or another, even if you're never going to make a map. So my friend Amber Boss, she's a researcher. She studies participatory mapping. So I'll stop the question and answer, but participatory, I was going to ask you, who knows what participatory mapping is? Okay, cool. All right, there's someone who does know. Awesome. Great, then I can tell you what it is. So she studies it. Not only does she participate in it, but she also studies it as an area of study. And participatory mapping, let me make sure that I get all out for you clearly. It's when local communities make maps that tell their stories rather than trusting the professional cartographers to tell their stories. And the whole reason this exists is because professional cartographers are not telling their stories. And the entire reason why participatory mapping exists is because of that. They've been used as tools of power as long as people have been mapping to hoard resources, suppress communities, and protect the powerful. And so when professional cartographers like me aren't capturing the on-the-ground truth, these community-built maps become necessary tools. This is one of the groups that Amber got to work with in Atlanta. So, are they going to win cartography contests? Are they violating some cartography rules? Maybe, but they're still maps. These are still cartographers. And here's why. Because it's a creative way to convey information that matters to the map maker in order to tell you what's important about that space. So I'm going to give you a bit of whiplash and go into the creative cartography side. But it was really important to me to let you know that about cartography before I tell you all this fluffy stuff about how pretty maps can be. Because even if you never make a map ever in your entire life, and you're still part of this, you're still subject to this conversation and spatial discourse that's happening in cartography. All right, so this is a map of, here we go, Uptown Waterloo, made by Warren Davison, who's a Canadian cartographer. I should tell you this. I'm going to talk about style influences, which is the first theme of creative cartography that we're going to address. And this is basically, for a long time, but really increasingly in the past few years, cartographers have been trying to mimic styles that already exist and to reproduce maps current day of, like, if you're interested in mid-century style, you just add that style to your map. It's a creative way to engage readers with your map. You're not just following the ubiquitous style. Your style is going to pop out. But it's also a great exercise into growing your own personal style. So back to Warren's map. It's of Uptown Waterloo, Ontario. It's this late 1800s style. It's really beautiful. If you lived there, you might be drawn into it more just because you might want to see, like, hey, there's my business on this really cool map style. And the cool thing about Warren, he's really creative, and he was unhappy with the fonts that he had access to for this map, so he went ahead and made his own font. It's not on this map, but he shared it, so I used it on this map that I'm going to show you in a minute, just to test it out on all my water labels. So it's a beautiful font. And this guy was so obsessed with the style that he went ahead and made his own font. Very inspiring. Here are some other samples of Warren Davis's work. Okay, this is all digital. He's using a vintage road atlas as his inspiration. It's really awesome and beautiful. He makes you think that this is printed on halftone. He also makes you think that it has fold marks because that's all digital. Super creative and cool. And he also did this thing which I love. These travel matrices, these distance matrices, I finally get to say this in a talk. A lot of you are too young to remember. People used to have paper maps in their cars, and this is how they would find out how far it is from one city to another. They're very useful, and I love that he made one. He also did buildings of Toronto. Just a lot of beautiful work. This is current day data, and now I want to look at his map. Okay, cool. And then the map on the right, he used a blueprint style, which is great because blueprints aren't used for land maps. But now I want to look at this map because he's using a completely different style than what I'm used to seeing. So now, by him doing that, I now know more about the Grand River watershed than I would have if he had not made this map. right. So here's that map I was telling you about before. I'm going to show you a few maps of this same exact extent. I did this for the entire purpose of exploring different styles. And I wanted to use the late 1800s, early 1900s USGS topos as my influence. So that's why I couldn't use his font. It was kind of violated that. But these aren't super exact either. Maybe I'll create my own font. But the USGS topos of this era have all been cataloged by the USGS. And when they do, they put this rubber stamp on them. And the words in the stamp vary depending on when it got stamped, but they all kind of look the same. And so, for that reason, I introduced that stamp into my design when I did my signature. Just one way to practice styles. Same exact style, but now we're using Art Deco tourism as our influence. Art Deco tourism posters are really distinct because of their really flourishy fonts and their super grotesque, huge iconography that's supposed to tell you what to think of the region. So I put this forest on the lower right and just without care put it right on top of the map. And then on the lower left, I used the Kala Kala, which is an Art Deco era ferry that went around the Puget Sound during that time. About a decade ago, there was some hope that it would be resurrected, but it has since turned into scrap metal. I know. And so here is that same extent, but I wanted to use pop art as my inspiration. And pop art, there's probably people in this room who could teach me more about pop art than I can teach you about it. But there are not a lot of rules, so it's kind of hard to mimic. So I just used this really heavy-handed, very unsubtle messaging. I have the very real human-created international boundary between US and Canada. And I was making this during the time when that orca mother was carrying around her dead baby calf for several weeks. And that is when a lot of us learned that the orcas that are in our local waters are starving, and they're not able to have viable offspring that survive. So orcas don't recognize international boundaries. So the one in the water, I just labeled each side. Orcas are starving here, and orcas are starving here. I got a little very heavy-handed with the northern border. About healthcare on the north side, I think it's universal, and where we are, it's very complicated. And then I had a heyday with this selfie queen and her Zach Morris telephone. Anyways, and then this is influenced by my favorite map. I use a 1950s sort of halftone style that uses 3 inks. That's what's great about using these old styles is they use so few inks. We have access to so many colors, RGB. So I wanted to try to use just black, blue, and red, just like my favorite map does. And speaking of minimal ink, there is a cartographer out there named Daniel Huffman, and his website is Something About Maps. And he hosted a first annual monochrome mapping competition for creative mappers to stretch the limits of one ink cartographically. He presented at this year's North American Cartographic Information Society conference, which was in Tacoma last month. And here are some of the submissions to that competition. So the map on the left, I want to make sure I get this right, is a gorgeous red and white map of Isla del Coco and the treasures that might be around that island. And Jacob Listabarth used just one red ink in a very data-rich story he's telling us with just that one ink. That map on the right was made by me. I decided to map all the areas you could drive to within 3 hours of Vancouver, British Columbia. And then I put the places you could drive to, or you could climb within that area. And I symbolized whether or not they're bouldering, ice climbing, or sport climbing, or thank you, traditional. And then, if it's outside of the area, I muted it a little, but it's all one single hue. Okay, so Jonah Atkins made the map on the left. This is all the green spaces in the city of Newport News, Virginia. And I really love Jonah. I love his cartography. He's very minimalist already. So it wasn't a stretch for him to do a monochrome map. And I really love how he gets me engaged with the spaces by putting them all on a normal map on the top, what we're used to seeing when I say normal, and then it individually maps them on the bottom. So I'm meeting each one of these spaces on their own terms. And the map on the right was made by a Washington State cartographer, Dan Coe. Has anybody heard of Dan Coe? Okay, he makes beautiful maps. He's a master of imagery and LiDAR mapping, and he made this really awesome dark map of the Newberry caldera in Oregon. All right, so let's see if this works. So that monochrome mapping competition is a great way of how we cartographers sort of collaboratively engage. It's also always usually done on Twitter, just like the 30-day map challenge that's going on right now. If any of you are on Twitter or Instagram, you can look up that hashtag and you'll see a lot of maps that people are making. And it's like any hashtag 30-day challenge. Each day of the month, you're given a different thing to do. So like today, you'd be focusing on boundaries. But what that means could be very different. You could take your own creative take on it. Now I'm going to do this long distance thing and show you. Where's my mouse? Okay. Ooh, there we go. Yeah, so if I hit refresh, maybe we'll see what people are putting out there today. This one kind of floated to the top. But it's a great way to just, if you're interested in participating, everybody will be happy to have you. I really love this map. It's by Greg Fisk. So he did it on the day that it was elevation, and he decided to show elevation of basically exaggerating the places on Earth where it's warming the fastest due to climate change. Oh, sorry. You guys, you still want to see that? Greg Fisk on Twitter, if you guys are interested in seeing more of that. Good, okay. Another way that I'll show you, the last one, is hashtag Creative Carto every first Sunday of the month. You can share maps that you're making and you can get feedback or just say, I'm doing this awesome thing. It's created by Vanessa Konopke-Wetzel, and you could go to that website. I'll share all these websites at the end if you wanted to use resources to make maps, but it's just one way that we kind of stay in touch and share and collaborate. So here's a map made by Stephen Smith. This was influenced by 1940s maps that a lot of people had hanging on their wall. And I asked all the cartographers that I'm showing you their work today if I could share their map with you. And he was so excited. And he's like, yes, if you're going to do that, why don't you also show them this? Oh, Madison Draper. Here she. This is almost identical to the 1940s version map that influenced his map. But this is also all current day data built on a computer. Madison Draper works at Mapbox, and she just basically applied this style, across the whole Earth. Really beautiful way to get creative with maps. And awesome. Okay, so obviously people have been making maps by hand a lot longer than they've been using computers. But there's a movement in mapping today. I'm saying movement might be too strong, but trend is, I think, too weak, to return to hand-drawn mapping. So we're using digital maps to inform our to get the data right and to get the accuracy right, but we're hand-drawing them. Or we're mimicking hand-drawn looks using GIS and CSS and graphic design software. So here's a video of me drawing a map with an actual pencil of it's a glacier, or it's a mountain in Alaska. At cerebellmaps.com, if you're interested in, I did some tutorials and some talks, and if you go there, you can find them. And so Molly O'Halloran is someone who also does a lot of handmade maps. She is a very wonderful person, very talented. She makes digital and watercolor maps, and sometimes she mashes the two together. And I'm going to share her link at the end too, but I just wanted to share the way the terminology she uses for this type of technique. She calls it hand-rendered and computer-compiled, which is very honest. A lot of people want you to think that they just freehand drew this super accurate map. She's very honest about it, but also if you're paying Molly to make a handmade map, you know you're going to get an accurate map. So I'm going to borrow this term from her from now on. So who has heard of Stamen? Great. Stamen is probably part of the reason. I'm not going to pan and zoom because it would require me going back to there, but it's a little older, right? It's been around, this watercolor-based map that I think Alan McConkey, who is a local cartographer here, who is the lead cartographer at Stamen, I think he had a lot to do with this design. But if you pan it, you can pan and zoom at different levels. You zoom in, streets pop up, but it still always looks like a watercolor map. And this has been around for several years, and I think it's part of the reason why a lot of us are trying this out. I think it influenced us a lot. Very beautiful map. Heather Smith is another cartographer at Esri. Oh, this is going to be hard. She's actually an artist, a bona fide artist, but she's also a cartographer. And she made this map of, I'm sorry, I'm going to mispronounce it. It's Ichurup Island. But it's a disputed island between Japan and Russia. And she made these mountains. She hand drew them and then created digital art out of them and then put them on this map to give it sort of this inky look. She's very creative. And she used that same technique for another map that's going to be really hard for me to show you, but I'm going to give it a try. Oh, here it is, the Mines of the Mojave Desert. So we have these sort of sugar lumpy-ish mountains that are all digital, but she was also trying to mimic that, two things going on here: hand-drawn mountains and an older style. So she did this trick that we do. If you were to use super crisp fonts on a map like this, it would immediately give it away that it was made today. So she kind of aged the typeface digitally. Very creative. Okay, so there's John Nelson, who's my colleague. This is John and I last week, actually, a week ago yesterday, we got to go to Adobe Max in LA and talk to designers about map making for designers. He's also one of these folks that does a lot of creative mapping. He does textures on, yeah, so this is all digital. But what he'll do is he'll put an image in the GIS so that GIS data renders as the image. It repeats, and if you make it look seamless, then it looks like a paper-cut map. It's pretty awesome. And he is from Michigan, so he's mapping places that he wants us to care about, which is Michigan. It's very beautiful. And you don't just have to do paper. Here's one he did that looks like a woodcut map. And I know I have not seen woodcut maps more than I have seen in Bellingham, Washington. They're very popular here. But you can make one digitally. And what's cool about about that is he shares these styles for you. You could go to his website and download them. And he did one in felt. And Joanna Merson is a researcher at the University of Oregon who's studying deer migration, and she used his felt mapping to show deer migration. And this kind of reminds me of that old Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer movie. It's very cute. And now I know more about deer migration because of her creativity. Here we go. Okay, so my friend and talented cartographer Rosemary Wardley and Riley D. Champion made this map. They both work for the National Geographic. This static map is a reproduction of Jeff Verzoko's map, which was interactive. This one's static, that highlights the nightlife, the LGBTQ nightlife in New York City over the past very many years, decades, in fact. And the National Geographic published this map in their June 2019 issue, marking 50 years since the Stonewall riots. And this is really cool. So recently, National Geographic published a special issue, which was entirely created by women. Rosemary was part of this team, and she helped make these maps inside the issue. And the map on the right is showing you women's level of inclusion in their society, and this means economic, social, and political spheres. So this is a current issue if you all want to go out and check it out. All right, so in closing, I want to remind you that every single map has been created to tell you a story about what the map maker thinks that you should know about that area. Maps are usually taken as truth and rarely questioned. but maps are abstractions, and this is necessary. You can't put everything that exists in one space on a page, but when you abstract, there are choices for who or what to include and who or what to omit. So I just want you to move forward with that in mind every time you read a news article that's telling you about space, or you see a map, just question it. So thank you very much for letting me talk to you. Here are the resources that I just threw at you this entire time. You can take a picture if you're interested in mapping yourself, and that's all. Thank you.